So, good afternoon, everybody. I will start today on this chapter about internal migration, but I just wanted to go back a little bit about the exam. So in our course website, in the syllabus, it's really important for you to remember the criteria that we have here for grading. So on page 3 of the syllabus, we have pretty much like 20% of the points come from the exam 2, 3, and final exam, and then 20% of for the quizzes, the 20 quizzes that we call the semester. And I mentioned, if you go back to my lectures on YouTube, since maybe the first day of classes, that the topic that is covered on exam 3, it's usually the one that students have the most difficulty having good grades. And that's exactly what happened. And after exam 1 and 2, I pretty much said that you guys did a good job, but you should keep studying. And then exam 3 was not so good. And just a reminder, I mentioned every point counts in this class for every single quiz. Assignments are not graded on a curve, and the grades will not be rounded up. So 59.9 is an F, 69.9 is a D, and so on, right? And so, but this is the overall grade distribution for the course, for the class right now. The first thing that we see, if we put the 16 quizzes together, only one person, 1.5% of the class, got at least 90% of the points on the quizzes. And that's 20% of the grade. 26% got a C, 20% got a D, and 40% of the people got an F. A lot of those people here are the ones that are missing quizzes. And quizzes are important, again, 20% of the overall grade. And this is crazy for me to have just one person who got A's, considering the 16 quizzes together so far. Because if you go into the instructions about exams, on quizzes, you actually have more time per question than during the exams. In the final exam, you're going to have more time per question. But on quizzes, it's more than what you have in exams. I don't know if people are taking quizzes while they're walking or eating or doing whatever, but this is a graded assignment. And so I suggest you taking quizzes in the same serious way as you take exams with your notes on the side, is our open book and so on. When we go into exam 1 and 2, then we see really good grades. Almost 60% of the class got an A on exam 1 and 76% got an A on exam 2. And this is the result of exam 3. 4 people, 5.9% got an A. And B, C's, D's, and a lot of people get an F. And I have been receiving emails from people that did not complete the exam without an excused absence. I will not reopen the exam for those people. And it's everything I'm just doing following the policies of the university, right? Just with excused absences, I will reopen, so I have to send medical notes and this kind of stuff. And but that makes the grade of people fall a lot. And as I have said, all the dates of quizzes and exams, they are in the syllabus, right? And if we see here, now we have left pretty much 5 more lectures, and it's going to be pretty much cover internal and international migration, 2 classes before Thanksgiving and 3 classes after. And then 1 week later, we have the final exam. And it's really easy to blame the professor. I'm just one person. But you guys know, you guys who are here in the classroom, that the most number of students that we have attending in person the classroom, today we have 6 people, but usually we have around 12. And if you go to the YouTube channel, I mean, for example, 27 people here, maybe 27 people who watch this one here, let's say that they are different than the ones that are in the classroom. Plus 12, 39, let's say 40 people watching the lectures either on YouTube or in person, 40 people out of 72. So 32 people are not even watching the lectures. So these grades here are really, really fair, right? And the current total, it's also really fair. It's actually too many Bs. If I have to do something for this class in the future, is to push harder on exams 1 and 2, right? So that's exactly the opposite of what students would suggest. But so far we have 5 people in the class with an A, which means 7.4%, and 42 with a B and 29 with a C. But I usually suggest students don't think what they have right now, because in order to have a C, they have to accomplish 70% out of the 100 points. B, 80 points, A, 90 points, and nobody has that yet, right? Because we just had so far 76 points, and we still have 24 points to go, 4 from quizzes and 20 from the final exam. So what I just say is, like, take the last 4 quizzes seriously and the final exam as well. People are saying, oh, my internet connection broke. I mean, this is an exam. Take it in a place where the internet connection is good. We're at Texas A&M. We have several places here, libraries, several places with no noise, good places to take exams, really good internet connection. And information about this, possible problems with internet connection, it was informed already in the instructions about quizzes. And this link to this document is at the top of every quiz and exam that you guys are taking throughout the semester. And yeah, so I really suggest, and as usual, in the lecture, right after the exam, we don't have a quiz because we don't have enough material covered new to be asking the quiz. So we don't have a quiz today, but in the next 4 lectures right after the end of them, you have the quizzes as usual and the final exam at the end. And again, quizzes with more time to answer, only 2 questions, open book. The distribution of grades on quizzes is really, really bad, right? Only 1 person got an A. Yeah, so these are like some of the things that I wanted to say. And the problem is that the people that probably need to hear that, they are not here in this classroom, and they are not gonna watch the lecture on YouTube. But one thing that I might do is give an extra credit activity. I'm not gonna reopen exams for people who forgot to take the exam for no reason. But I will give an extra credit activity that I have to think a little bit about it. But I will try to post it by next Tuesday, the 23rd. Our last class is on the 7th. And I will ask you to, the deadline to submit the extra credit activity, it's gonna be on the 10th. And the final exam, it's going to be on the 15th, on the date stipulated by the university. That's another thing. Some people are graduating on the 16th and keep asking me, why do we have the final on the 15th? That's the university date. It's not something that I can change. But I will give some extra credit activities here. It's pretty much going to be a few questions. I still have to think how much it will be worth everything. You pretty much just download this PDF from the course website. I will send the link by email. Or you can just go to the website and answer the question on a Word document, and then we will upload it on Canvas, and then I can grade it. And it's going to be uploaded to that Turnitin platform that kind of searches for plagiarism. So write with your own words. I regraded and post the grades before the 16. I usually post the grades to everybody before the deadline for people who are graduating that semester. Cool? All clear? But yeah, so you just give an extra credit activity. I don't even think I have to. I'm just being really easy professor by doing that. But I will. But I have to give the same opportunity to all students, right? Not just to the ones who, for no reasonable reason, miss exams. Cool? Awesome. So let me see. So I think I covered everything that I wanted to say. The grade distribution is the important thing here to talk. And then we're going to move into the lecture about internal migration. So this lecture here, I'm pretty much like covering most of the content that has in the textbook, but I do add some more things in the concepts and definitions and in measures of migration as well, but concepts and definitions that I add more things into the slides than they are covered in the textbook. And everything that appears here in the lecture, in the covered in the exam. So introduction, concepts and definitions, measures of migration, and then domestic migration in the US. This part here about analysis of spatial association is completely extra. It's based on a research project that I'm doing about internal migration in the US. I will just show you some preliminary results that we have by now. And this portion here about internal migration in China, called in the textbook as temporary migration or floating migration, it is in the textbook, but I will not go into detail about it in the classroom, so I will not ask questions about that portion in the exam. The exam, the portion about internal migration is going to be covered. I will cover these parts here, okay? So we talked a lot about fertility and mortality in these last classes. And another demographic, the third demographic component is migration. And migration can make a population to increase or decrease, right? If a specific area or country, state, city, county receives a lot of people, a lot of migrants, their population will tend to increase, maintaining everything else constant. And then same thing about people leaving. If people leave that area, then the population will tend to decrease. So the size of population decreases in the area of origin, those areas that are losing migrants, are losing population that are going to other places, and the population increases in the area of destination, those areas that are receiving migrants. And unlike fertility and mortality, the event of migration might happen on multiple occasions or never happen during our lifetime. This is kind of a statement that in the textbook, but fertility also happens in multiple occasions. And mortality just once, of course, but we also saw in the chapter about fertility that a lot of people and women are deciding to don't have children at all. So we already had a lot of men who didn't have children at all in their lives, but the proportion of women who decide to don't have children in terms of fertility in their lifetime is also increasing, the ones that don't want to have children. So the possibility of not having experiencing fertility at all during your lifetime also exists in the same way as migration. But the interesting thing about migration is that specific groups may experience it several times, in both internal migration, people migrating within countries, or international migration, people moving between countries. So, sorry here. And what exactly is migration? So I tried to go back to these old definitions of migration just to show that this study, trying to understand population flows between populations or within populations, this study has been done for several decades already, or centuries. So Lee, back in 1966, defined migration as being a permanent or semi-permanent change of residence. In this perspective, no restriction is placed upon the distance of the move or upon the voluntary or involuntary nature of the act. Here in the US, the Census Bureau usually considers internal migration someone who moves between counties. People who move within counties, by the official definition of the Census Bureau, it's not considered internal migration. It's usually considered more a move of residence. People moving from from kind of like more related to mobility. People changing neighborhoods, right? But the official definition of internal migration in the US is that someone has to move to another county, has to cross a county border to be considered internal migrant. But some other definitions and in some other countries that might change. Any move, even from one neighborhood to the other within the same city or the same county, could be considered internal migration. And this project that I mentioned before that I'm doing about internal migration in the US, it is using American data and data collected by the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau actually has, for some areas, in some years, information about block group of current residents and block group of residents 1 year before, using the American Community Survey, or 5 years before, using old demographic census. And in that case, since I have this information for more detailed area of geography, I can estimate internal migration flows even between block groups and call it internal migration. I just have to make it clear what's the definition that I'm using to call someone an internal migrant or not. But whenever someone asks you what's the official definition of internal migrant by the US Census Bureau, is someone changing residence in a permanent way from one county to the other, at least, right? I can move to another state, but I have to at least cross a county boundary. And migration, it can be both people migrating to other countries or coming from other countries, so international migration, or internal migration, people moving within countries. Every act of migration involves an origin and a destination in a series of factors that make people be more likely to migrate from one area to the other. Whenever we are trying to analyze mortality and fertility, usually we focus on the place where the person is having their children, and the place where people are dying. In migration, in order to analyze the full picture, it's important to understand where these people came from and where they are right now. And what was the distance? What was what is the level of unemployment in both areas of destination and origin? What is the level of poverty? What are the educational possibilities for these people to go to college in one place and the other. If there are no universities, people tend to move out to other places. So here in Brazos County, we have a lot of people moving here exactly to attend college. So there are a series of intervening set of obstacles, and it's not just distance, but also differentials between the areas of origin and destination. Yeah, distance is always present as being something like the longer the distance between one area to the other, the smaller is going to be the levels of migration. And whenever we include distance as one reason of why people are migrating, we call those models as gravity models, like really the gravity, areas attracting migrants. The closer two areas are, let's say stronger the gravity, more migration there is. Farther away the areas are, weaker is the gravity. The migration we tend to have fewer people migrating from one area to the other, right? This term gravity models is usually used a lot by economists dealing with human migration across areas. Whenever we take distance as one set of explanatory variables, as one independent variable in the model to explain migration. Migration in this case as the dependent variable. So the definition of migration, permanent change of residence. So it also takes into account that people might have been doing residential mobility, people who improve their socioeconomic status, their educational attainment, then they can afford to live in better neighborhoods, in better places. So migration might be a response to improve in mobility or even a decline in socioeconomic status. Moving a great enough distance that all activities are transferred from one place to the other. So if I live in Houston and I come to College Station only to teach here a couple of days in the week, that's not migration, I'm just commuting. If I live in Austin and I do the same thing, I'm just commuting. I live, my residence is in Austin. So in that case, I can't do work about commuting, about people moving, actually crossing even county boundaries to go to work every day or a couple of days in the week, or even crossing states. A lot of people even travel by airplane to work and stay a week. But those, so those activities, I'm not transferring my residence completely. When I transfer my residence completely, then I'm a resident in that specific place. If I'm just commuting, that's not internal migration. And international migrants are those that move between countries, either legally or without documentation. Internal migrants, they move within national boundaries, without constraint, but not always. In the last portion of this chapter about internal migration in China, which we will not cover in detail in the course, the main point is that migration from China from rural areas to urban areas, it's actually regulated by the government. Only if the government gives you permission to move from rural areas to urban areas, you're supposed to move. What about if the government doesn't give you permission, but you move anyways? Then you cannot have a job in the formal labor market. Your children don't have access to public schools. You don't have access to public health services, and your family doesn't have either. So because the daily life in China is so controlled by the state, a lot of people who would like to move from rural areas to urban areas do not get the permission from the government, but they still move. But they know that if they move with the whole family, that would be detrimental to the education and health of their family members. So what happens nowadays a lot in China is the migration from rural to urban areas without the approval of the government, but the children and other family members stay in the rural area, while only usually the man moves to the urban areas. And still that worker not having the possibility to work in the labor market, the formal labor market, it's kind of like a cost and benefit analysis. They see that by going to the urban area, they will still make more money and they can send money back to their place of origin where the family members stay. So internal migration here in the US, we can move from one area to the other without any problem. We usually move when there is a reason. I'm moving with my family, because of marriage, because of I'm pursuing my university degree, or because I got a new job. These are reasons why we move. And usually there is no constraint on that. It's usually more financial or family constraints if you have a spouse and children and so on. But in some countries, that's not always the case, as is the example for China. So whenever you're trying to measure migration, we have to think about this term impermanence. Permanence usually means that you have been gone at least 1 year from the old place. So the American Community Survey is the source of data, one of the most important sources of data in the US to analyze migration. Of course, there are others as well, but the American Community Survey is one of the most important ones. And in the American Community Survey, there is a question first, what's your residence? And of course, when you receive the questionnaire from the American Community Survey, the Census Bureau already knows the place where you're living because the questionnaire you receive at home. But one of the questions there is, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? And as I mentioned before, in decennial census, the ones that happen every 10 years, like the ones that just happened now in year 2020, in American Community Survey that happens every year, the date of reference is April 1st. And here in the US, this date of reference is called the census day. So if in the American Community Survey, it's usually the questionnaire is sent only to around 1% of the households in the US. And if you are in the sample and you receive, let's say, the questionnaire now in 2021, there is a question, where did you live exactly on April 1st, 2020, exactly 1 year ago? Because all the answers that you are giving in the questionnaire are related to your residence this year in April 1st. And the question about migration is April 1st, exactly 1 year ago in 2020. And so this thing about permanence is important because it's pretty much saying, I'm trying to measure the migration from 1 year ago. Of course, you can say in April 1st, 2020, I was living in New York, but maybe from New York, you moved to LA, live there for a couple of months, and now you are in College Station. So with this question about the fixed date in the past, we lose these moves in between. Right? But there's not an approximation of migration of 1 year. In the decennial census, up to the 2000 census, the question about migration was also asked. But then in the decennial census, we would ask, here in the US, they would ask, where did you live exactly 5 years ago? So in the 2000 census, it was asked the question, where did you live exactly on April 1st, 1995? But then in the 2010 census and also in the 2020 census, these more detailed questions are not asked. As I mentioned in that lecture about sources of demographic information, up to the 2000 census, you have the more detailed questionnaire, which would be sent to just a sample of the population, and you have the short form with a few questions about age, sex, race, ethnicity, whether you own the house or not, your relationship with the head of the household, the short form is supposed to be sent to everybody, to all households. The long form was sent just to a sample of the population, and it was sent also during the censuses up to 2000. And then it started in 2005, this long form with more detailed information, including migration, started being part of the American Community Survey. So the American Community Survey happens every year since 2005, has all these detailed questions. And then in the following census, 2010 and 2020, only the short form is implemented to the full population of households in the country, right? But whenever we ask information about migration, we have to think that the person lives in that place, or at least we have to get some measure that try to get residents in that place for at least 1 year. We could also ask the question, for how long have you been living in this specific place? But the duration of residence is not a question that has been so common anymore. And in the US, it's not asked. We just ask, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? The distance moved in the US also determines if someone is an internal migrant or not, as I mentioned before. The Census Bureau defines a migrant as a person who has moved to a different county within the US. So if I move within counties, officially, I'm not an internal migrant using this criteria from the Census Bureau. However, from the standpoint of a local school district, a migrant would be someone moving into or out of the school district boundaries. Because if a policymaker is trying to think about how many resources we have to send to specific schools, how many teachers we have to hire, and so on, I have to know what's the population in that school district. And so in that case, it might be interesting to see migration of people within counties or even within cities, people migrating from one school district to the other, because then I will have an idea what's going to be the demand for public schools, for public education, right? And but even like for private schools, that would be the same, because if a private school is trying to expand, they also should try to understand what's the dynamic of migration within the cities, people moving from one place to the other, and then they might try to create new schools, specific areas of the city. But in terms of public schools, migration that crosses these school districts is important, because then we can better understand the demand for the schools in that specific area. So that's one instance in which this definition of what's a migrant, it has to move from one county to the other. It might not be so interesting, that definition, from the point of view of a policymaker trying to deal with demands of schools in specific school districts. And we talked about in the demographic transition theory about people improving their health, so people dying with less intensity due to communicable diseases, so infant mortality declines a lot, people start to live longer, so mortality declines, and then after a while, fertility starts to decline as well. Because now people realize that they don't have to have so many children for them to survive to older ages, but also because it starts to get expensive to have so many children. And so we have their mortality and fertility transition. But we also have migration transition, which is the permanent move of people from one area to the other. Usually, people move out of one area of origin because there is some scarcity of resources. Even rural areas that might not have such a big population, maybe they have a big population in relation to the jobs that are available there. So even in some rural areas that the population size is pretty small, there are no educational opportunities for people who want to go to the university. There are no jobs, high-paying jobs. So people might move to other areas, to the areas of destination, exactly because they perceive that those areas will give them better resources, better housing, better education opportunities, better jobs, and so on. Whenever we talk about migration transition, we are talking about urbanization. People moving from rural to urban areas. So the migration transition is really related to the urban transition, because in these last centuries and decades, people have been moving more from rural areas to urban areas than the opposite. And even when some urban areas start to be more saturated with not as many opportunities for people, people start to move from one urban area to another urban area, even from big cities into mid-sized cities, right? So migration starts to get a little bit more complex. That's not so simple as people moving from rural to urban. They might move to a place to get a university degree, and then afterwards they start to apply for jobs, and then they move to another urban area, either a bigger town or a smaller town, right? But this process of migration transition is really related to the urbanization process. Cool? And whenever we talk about migration, there are two concepts that are important to understand: flows and stock of migrants. Migration transition involves a process and a transformation. So what exactly is the migration flow and the migration stock? The migration flow is a process of people moving from one place to another within a specific period. So with the question from the American Community Survey, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? So how many people live here right now? And then I can see how many of these people who live here right now enter this area, enter this county, for example, in this last year. So it's a specific period of 1 year. So people are moving from one place to another within a specific time interval. After this flow of people keeps going on, and you have back and forth. Sometimes some areas attract more people than in other times. But after all these years, decades of people moving from one area to the other, right now, how many people are here in Brazos County that were born somewhere else, were born in another county in the US? That's migration stock. That's a transformation of the population caused in the areas of origin and destination as people move out and in to specific places. So I could ask, how many people with the American Community Survey, how many people moved to Brazos County this last year? April 1st, 2020 to now, April 1st, 2021, the date of reference, the census date. But in the American Community Survey, there is also the information about place of birth. Usually you get information about county of birth. I think public available data, you have only information about state of birth. Now my recollection, I don't know if there is county of birth specific in the American Community Survey, but you could try to understand in Brazos County, how many people live here right now who were born outside of the Texas state. So in this case, I'm not delimiting a specific time interval. I'm saying right now, in 2021, how many people live in Brazos County who were born outside of Texas? That's the migration stock. Then we are trying to understand the transformation that this migration is causing in the area of destination. But I could also see the other way around, how it's, this transformation is causing, how this migration is causing transformations in the area of origin. If one place is losing a lot of people to others within the country, for years and decades, I can see right now how many people, for example, who were born in Ohio and are now living in other places in the US. And then I can see this all the perspective of how the out-migration from the state of Ohio might be affecting the composition of the population in this state of origin, this example that I just gave. The amount of migrants and areas of origin in this nation at a specific time are measured after a history of population flows that happen in the past years, in the past decades, in the past centuries, right? So the flows are happening within specific timelines, specific time intervals. So we could even apply that to international migration. How many people moved from Mexico to the US in the last year? That's flow, migration flow. Migration stock is right now in the US. What's the overall number of people living in the US who were born in Mexico? That's migration stock. So the same concept of flows and stock can be applied or can be investigated for internal and international migration. And this is just a conceptual model trying to understand why people migrate, the decision of people to migrate. And the migration behavior or migration intentions, they have a set of different factors that influence them. First, you have what in the text is mentioned as the propensity to migrate. Individual human capital attributes. So what's my education? What's my training for specific job activities? What are my characteristics in terms of risk-taking? Migrating from one area to the other is risky. I can migrate and not get a job. I can migrate and fail in having a better life quality. What's my, what is the likelihood of me being open to take the risk? And what are the household characteristics and resources that people have in their origin, and also the information that I have about household resources and characteristics in their destination. And we talked about the theory of migration developed by that economist Todaro. He mentions that internal migration keeps happening, and in his case, he was focusing on rural to urban migration, keeps happening even if urban areas don't have as many good jobs as people might think. But if people perceive urban areas as having better job opportunities and better life opportunities, people will keep migrating from rural to urban areas. And here, this applies the same thing. The household characteristics and resources. What do I think the resources are available to my household in the area of destination? If I think, if the information that I have, which is limited about the destination, is that over there we have better life opportunities, I would tend to out-migrate from my current area and immigrate to this other place. Household family migration norms. Some families, they have stronger ties, so people tend to live closer to each other. And those ties, family ties, they are not just defined by culture because I was born in another country, then I tend to be more close to my family than, for example, the average American. No, these migration norms and family ties, they are also defined, they also vary within countries, right? In some areas in the US, people might be more tied into their family members, so they would tend to get out of those areas with fewer chances, even though the opportunities to work there are not so good. So we are going this propensity to migrate. Just look, we are aggregating the information. We have individual level variables in these first two boxes, and then household level characteristics that make be more likely to migrate or not. And then community characteristics. The place where I live right now, it has really low job opportunities, low education opportunities. I would tend to get out and to go into other areas. And what is also my knowledge about migration? Do I know about specific job opportunities in another place because I have already a friend or a family member who migrated to that place before? These networks, these social networks, migration networks, will make me more likely to migrate. Something that we discussed also in the lecture about theories of migration. So all these individual, household, and community level variables, they influence the motivation to migrate. Some of them will stimulate people to out-migrate from one area to the other because people think that migration will benefit my life. Other of these factors say, no, actually, I have a strong family connection here. I have a good house, good job opportunities. So the cost to get out of this place would be really high, so I will tend to stay. So some of these variables here might act as a benefit or as a constraint to people to migrate. And then that influences the intentions of people. And then the final behavior, right? I might want to move, but I never move. And the final behavior of migration is the final decision. People will migrate in a permanent way from one place to another. And what we try to understand, what were the factors that influenced that decision? Do you remember when we were talking about fertility with John Bones that came up with the approximate determinants of fertility, and he mentioned 4 main approximate determinants that explain most of the variation in fertility. So proportion of women married, abortion, postpartum fecundability, and use of contraception. I mean, there are other approximate determinants. He shows empirically that these 4 approximate determinants are the ones that determine most of the decisions of women having more or less children. And Martin Bell, he retired. He's a professor. He's a demographer, and he used to teach in an Australian university. His colleagues tried to organize this framework of migration and collect data and understand what sources of data are available in different countries in the world related to focusing on internal migration. And they came up with this framework to understand migration in the same way that we saw before for fertility. We have these major factors, contextual factors that influence people migrating. There are social, economic, demographic, cultural, and religious factors that might influence people to migrate. But these are really general factors that it's hard for us to measure. I mean, I still can get information, for example, about unemployment rate in the area of origin and destination. I can get information about race, ethnicity, composition. I can get information about the proportion of immigrants as an approximation of a measure to understand culture. And also what's the proportion of people in specific religious groups similar to mine that would make me more likely to migrate from one area to the other. I can still think about some variables to measure these contextual factors. But migration, the final outcome, the final decision of people migrating from one place to the other can be better understood by what they also call the approximate determinants of migration, the same way as we did for fertility. There are these big contextual factors, but these factors influence a series of different decisions or changes that people pass through their lifetime. This could be also be called like the life course transitions. And then these life course transitions influence the final decision to migrate. And what are some examples of these life course transitions? When I enter in the university, when I apply to college and I'm accepted to college, and I will move from one place to the other, from one county to the other, to pursue my education. So entrance in higher education. After I finish college, I will tend to move out from the place where I finish my college, because usually in that area, I might not have job opportunities as I would have in other places. And after, when I actually enter the labor force, when I get a job offer, and flexible about moving to another place, then my chance of migration increases. When I get married, when there is the union formation, I will tend maybe to migrate to a place with my partner, and then after that, life starts to get more stable, and the chances of migration declines. So when I have children, my children are going to go to school, so I tend to stay in the same place, thinking about my family. But what about if I get divorced? If I get divorced, then I will have more flexibility to move to another place. About when my children start going to the university. When my children start going to the university, then the life will be really relaxing at home. And then I have even more flexibility to migrate to another place, right? And finally, when I retire, I don't have to be in a specific place to work. Then my chances to move to another area even increase. And we have seen a lot of migration into the southern states in the US of more older people. The weather, the climate is better, right? Than states in the north with colder weather. But all these life course transitions, they influence the chance of people migrating more or less from one place to the other. And this information here, from this framework, from this diagram in a graph format, can be shown like this from the same authors, Martin Bell and his colleagues. We have here migration. Pretty much we can think about this as a migration rate, right? Migration intensity and age groups. And this curve here is what we say that's a typical curve of migration by age. What's the typical curve of fertility by age? Fertility, remember, is that inverse U-shape curve. Mortality. It's high here for infant mortality, let's put here. It's high here for infant mortality, declines, and then afterwards starts to increase again, right? So you have for fertility, this shape here usually. For mortality, high infant mortality, and then the child survives, and then afterwards keeps increasing until older ages. So these are the typical curves of fertility and fertility here and mortality by age. The same typical curves we can see in migration as well. So what happens is that when people are young and to live with their family members, and the chances of them moving out, even with their family members, is small. So these rates here tend to be smaller. And usually, real rates calculated, this is a more hypothetical, this is more theoretical here, but real rates of people below the age of 15 they usually mirror a lot the migration of these people here, because these people here are usually the parents of these people here. So one analysis, one simple analysis that you can start doing of this map, this graph, is this. Did your result from a specific area had this shape here? What does it mean? Is that people are migrating from one area to the other. The children here are moving with their parents. In this other example that we have in blue, we have actually the kind of like a smaller chances of migrating when we have with our children compared to who tend to be my parents. So in this case, this example here is kind of saying that these parents are moving without their children from one place to the other. So a simple graph like this, by comparing the rates of children with the rates of people between the 30, 45 years of age, kind of show whether people are migrating within a country or even between countries as a family group, or only the adults moving and leaving the kids behind, maybe with another relative or someone else, right? But as people get older and they enter in college, like pursuing higher education, then the chances of migrating increase because people are looking for education. So they move when they are around 18 years of age, and they stay there. And when they exceed and they get another job, their chances of migration is really high. So people, when they graduate, let's say around 22 years of age, and then they get a job, the chances of migrating are really high. I'm not saying that everybody will migrate, but the chances are high. Then people get married, start to get more settled, have the first child, the chance of migrating declines, might have a job change. Still, I have some chance of migrating to another place, but if I tend to be less risk averse, I would tend to move to another job within the area where I live already. When the child leaves the household, I still have some chance of migrating out because then now I have more flexibility to move to wherever I want. I don't have to be with that same area where my children were pursuing education. But then the chance of migrating decreases in the next years. As people get retired, the chance of migrating increases a little bit more, declines after that, and then when people start to need more assistance because of disability and so on, because they're getting old, then they move. The chances of moving again increase because they're moving to institutions to health, institutions to get help. But usually this curve here and this increase here are harder to actually get with empirical data because the sample size there tends to be really small. But you usually see this first shape here. And one first question is, the migration of children is in the same level in trend as these ones here, as their parents or not? We're gonna see some examples of migration that you actually see something like this. So that means that actually these people here who are migrating are all migrating with their children, and you have actually high fertility, right? So a simple curve of migration rates by age group can tell us a lot, okay? And the same way as we did for mortality and fertility. This is an example of these different shapes of migration that we can find for China, Portugal, and Brazil. And this is actually empirical data. So we have a scale here in the vertical axis. This one was theoretical, was just to show the approximate determinants of migration. For Brazil, and this is data, I mean, it's based probably from 2010 census from these countries, or 2010, around the year 2010. So for Brazil, you see, okay, the migration for children here kind of like looks kind of flat, but overall, the migration intensity, migration rates for people in labor ages is not so much higher than this one here. So that's an indication that these people are migrating within Brazil with their children going with them. And as I said before, you don't see that much variation as we saw in that theoretical curve in the previous slide for older groups. But for Portugal, for example, you also see children migrating with their parents here. And what's another difference that you see between Portugal and Brazil? The chances of people migrating in these labor ages are much higher than among the ones in Brazil. Internal migration in Portugal is more frequent, proportionally, than in Brazil. Another thing that we see also, the highest migration rate that we see in Brazil is around the age of 25. In Portugal, it's around the age of 30. So people migrate within Portugal at older ages than in, right? That could be because people are moving in Portugal after they finish education. And since in Portugal, higher education, even graduate school is more affordable, people tend to stay in the same place until they finish grad school, and then after that they move out. In Brazil, since we still have really low levels of the population with a college degree, and people actually move more because of job opportunities, you see higher rates among younger people, people finishing high school or right after college, moving out to job. So this is all speculation, right? These are all hypotheses in order to see if my possible answers to the reasons of having these different shapes are correct. I have to collect data. And usually this question about reason of migration is not available in these regular surveys that are collected in these countries. We have to collect specific surveys asking the reason of people migrating from one place to the other. But in Portugal, you do see an increase in migration of people at older ages, maybe going back to the households of their adult children now. So I'm older now, I'm 89, 85 years old, and I need assistance, so I move back to the household where one of my children live to get assistance. That could be one of the reasons here that we see in Portugal, or people moving to institutions, right? And then in China, you see a really, really strong migration, even at younger ages. So two things that we're analyzing here, two simple things that Martin Bell suggests. One thing is here. What's the highest migration rate? And what's the age in which that migration rate happens? So this information here, the highest migration rate is of people around 22 years of age in China. And this migration rate is really high. It's higher than 0.04. If we see in Portugal, the migration with the highest rate happens for people in older ages, around 30 years of age. And the intensity is not so high as in China. Brazil is in the middle here, around 25. And this rate, the intensity, much lower than in Portugal and China. So what these papers usually suggest, I mean, so many different shapes of this curve, different age groups, but just looking at these two indicators, what's the age in which you have the highest migration rate, and what's the value of that highest migration rate? Age, right here, and the highest migration rate observed. Age and highest migration rate observed. That gives us a lot of information. right? And what you China? You see in China that people are migrating at younger ages comparing to Brazil and to Portugal, and at really, really high levels. And this is usually because people migrate in China even before they complete university degree. People are moving because they are actually looking for jobs. So they are moving younger, like around the ages of, let's say here, 21, 22, or right after they finish college. The intensity, it's really, really high, above 0.04 in this example. What else do we have here? The migration intensity of children in China, really small. So what it's saying is that these people here who are migrating in China, who are probably the parents of these children, are migrating by themselves. And is that last portion of the chapter that Dudley Paulson discusses? Exactly because these people are moving from one place to the other in China without the government approval, and then their children would not have access to public school and health services, and they leave the other family members behind and they move by themselves. And that is kind of shown with these graphs. All right, so simple graphs like this, they don't give the complete answer to our questions, but they give some hints, some overall idea of the trends of migration. So I really like to estimate migration rates by age groups, and we can break it down by sex. So we can estimate this for men and women. And you can also estimate this for several years to see if that changes. And here, for each one of these countries, it's just saying who migrated from one place to the other in those countries. But I could say, for example, Brazil. We have Brazil here. The Northeast in Brazil is less developed than in the south of Brazil. That's where São Paulo and Rio are located. So I could break it down. I can say not only break it down by sex, age like here, and year, I can also see the migration from this less developed region to the more developed region. What is the shape of that migration? What about the opposite way? The migration from the more developed region to the less developed region. Usually when you do that, internal migration from less developed areas to more developed areas within countries, we have a shape similar to how China has here. People migrating because of jobs. What about the opposite? People migrating back from more developed areas to less developed areas within countries. Then they have a shape more similar to what Brazil is showing here. A little bit older, and people moving back with their whole family. So the levels of my children are high, their parents, or in the similar levels, right? So we can explore a lot. And you can imagine, if you have several years, if you can break down migration, like in the US, among all the counties, more than 3,000 counties, you can have migration from all 3,000 counties to all 3,000 counties by age group, by year, by sex. It's a lot of information that you can explore, right? A lot of that analysis can still be done even for the case of the US. This is an example of interaction in the US using the 2008 to 2009. This graph here, and also this one's about approximate determinants, they are from this chapter, this paper that's outside of the textbook. This figure from the US is from the textbook, it appears there. And pretty much here, it shows in the US that usually migration within the US, children are migrating usually with their parents. And as people get older, they tend to migrate more either back to where their adult children live so they can take care of the older people, or move into institutions. And in this case, in this graph, we can estimate these migration rates, internal migration rates, by age group. for a specific year, but also take into account different sets of unit of analysis. We can look at the rates for the total population. In the dark red here, we have the rates for taking into account individuals migrating from one area to the other. And the pink line, we have the migration of the household as a group, right? And kind of there are not as many differences, but you kind of see that when you look at the individual level, then you have more migration at older ages, because those are specific individuals that need more assistance, not the whole household. So even this simple difference here already tells a story to us. So internal migration is a geographical move resulting in a change of residence that cross a political jurisdiction boundary. In the US, this boundary is the county. So if I move from one county to the other, I'm considered internal migrating. Like we said, over time, migration is a story of people moving from rural to urban area. Even if the rural areas already have a small population size, if people don't have jobs, even in those areas with a small population size, they will tend to move out. And the population is almost entirely urban, which is the case of the US and Western Europe. People start to move from one urban area to the other. Even here in the US, whenever we say that one area is rural, a couple of miles by car, you have access to all these different services, grocery stores, you have health services, you have schools, you have even paved roads and all that, even in rural areas. So what we think as rural areas in the US is completely different than in other areas. But now that these developed countries, most of the population live in urban areas, most of the population, most of the moves happen between urban areas. And this process in which we stop having high urban rates and people actually migrating more from urban to other urban areas, this process is called migration evolution. And something related to what I said before, it's between a mover and a migrant, and who changes his or her residence is a mover. But not all movers are migrants, because a person can move within the same county, the same community, without involving the crossing of a political boundary. And if I think that moving to another county, that's what defines a migrant, if someone is moving from one neighborhood to the other within a county, or from one city to the other within a county, I might call that person just a mover, not a migrant. All migrants are movers because they are one kind of movers. They are that kind that they cross a political boundary. In the case of the US, they move to another county, at least, or to another state. The Census Bureau have estimated that a person in the United States may move around 12 times in one's lifetime. So that's the average. Some people move more, some people will move less. And that depends also the place where the people were born within the US. Migration is important not only because it affects individuals' lives, but also because it affects the society as a whole. When people migrate in high volumes from one area of origin to an area of destination, that affects both areas. So there are impacts on receiving and sending communities. The area that's sending this population, the donor area of origin, typically loses young adults. How do I know that? You saw the curves of migration by age group. Usually the highest are calculated for people in younger ages, young adults. And by having less young adults in these areas of origin, that might slow down population growth, because those people are usually the ones having children. The area of destination gains young adults. That might influence an increase in fertility, and young adults are the ones actually working in the labor market. That can create also economic development. But if these people start to compete for the same jobs, it can have negative impacts on their salaries in the area of destination. And the money that people send back from the area of destination to the area of origin might become a good resource of wealth for the people who stayed behind. If someone moves to another place and they send money back, and that money it's a lot in terms of the life standards that I live in the area of origin, that can influence positively the area of origin, although they have been losing people to other areas. So we finish this part here. I will continue on this lecture about internal migration on Tuesday. We do not have a quiz today because it's the first lecture of the exam. I just suggest you be careful with the next exam, with the next quizzes, and enjoy your weekend. Have a great weekend and see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.